Hey guys, can you all hear me? Yeah. Cool, my name's Taylor. I'm going to talk about market trading in the world, specifically how this trend looks and sort of how Bitcoin plays into it. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about an economist named Ronald Coase and transaction cost. And then who here has read Nick Szabo's essay on social scalability? Has anyone read that? Okay, so this will sound kind of familiar to y'all, but I'm going to sort of expand on that. So let me start with Ronald Coase. He was an economist in the 1930s, and he sort of talked about why do firms exist. So most of the people used to work hundreds of years ago on farms in agriculture. Today, most of us work in something that looks like this middle picture, an office. And now, people are increasingly trying to work in this kind of like gig economy fashion. So, why do these transitions happen? This is Coase. He wrote a paper in 1937 called The Nature of the Firm that basically asks, if markets are so efficient, if these are so great, why do we have these like planned economies that look like firms that operate within markets? And his answer was transaction cost. So there's three primary types of transaction costs in the economic literature. Is it reverbing a lot for y'all? Is it, what? A little bit? What's this? How's that? Okay. So triangulation, transfer, and trust. Triangulation, how hard is it to find and measure the quality of a good? Transfer, how do you bargain and agree on payment? And then trust, how do you sort of enforce that contract? So you think about like, in the abstract, you have 50 emails in your inbox. It might be more efficient to outsource each of those emails to someone that's an expert in that particular topic. In practice, the transaction costs are too high. You've got to find that person, you have to bargain, and you have to pay a contract with them. So you do it yourself, or you hire someone full-time that manages that. So sort of Coase's idea was in an economy where you have very high transaction costs, you tend to have firms be very large to absorb all those transaction costs, and consumers would tend to buy over rent. And in the opposite case, in low transaction costs, consumers would prefer to rent as opposed to buy, and you tend to have small firms. It's really bad. So sort of what determines transaction cost? I think the main determinant is technology. In 1314, there was a city in France called Caen. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation. They installed the first mechanical clock. And there's an inscription on it that said, I give the hour's voice to make the common folk rejoice, which is like a pretty big statement about a mechanical clock. And I think this sort of illustrates what's going on with transaction costs. So historically, time was kept in medieval European towns using a bell tower with a sundial. So you would have people that lived in the bell tower are responsible for it. And they would read the sundial, and they would go up and they would toll the bells to signal the time. You signal dawn and dusk and maybe noon. One, this was expensive. You had to have someone that lived in the bell tower was responsible for it. You had accuracy problems, right? If you had clouds, something as simple as clouds caused accuracy problems. And in practice, it could only signal a few events per day. You couldn't have the bell toll just for your lunch meeting. You had to have it for sort of these large events like a festival or sunrise or sunset. And so mechanical clocks solved these problems. They had an automatic striking feature. You didn't have to have someone live in the bell tower, so you could toll it more frequently. They were more accurate. They weren't relying, if clouds came through, it didn't matter. And kind of most importantly, I think they were provably fair. So one of the issues with sort of the sundial system was you weren't sure. People would often, workers would be concerned that landowners were bribing the bell tollers to toll earlier in the morning or later at night, so they had to work longer, whereas the mechanical clock was more difficult. So sort of taking these things together, transaction costs sort of determine how the structure of work is organized. Technology determines the transaction cost, and you sort of have this efficient frontier of coordination. So looking back at this historically, I think the clock is sort of one example. I would say we've sort of gone through a few different eras. The first you recall, like the Paleolithic, sort of like the beginning of human civilization or pre-civilization. Humans were unique because they could coordinate, right? Language in particular was an incredibly powerful tools of coordination, but compared to any other species on Earth, humans are better at coordinating. This started to shift with the Neolithic era. We went from bands of 30 to 150 people to cities of tens of thousands of people. And sort of the state became this limit of coordination scalability. If you have a city of 10,000 people, it allows specialization of labor, right? You can have people that are potters and people that are farmers, but it also requires it. You need that specialization to support a city of that size. And then over time, the sort of limits of coordination started to expand beyond just the city. So these are Lydian gold coins. And they were, the first retail market was in Lydia, and it was possible because of these gold coins. So one of the high transaction costs prior to coinage was you had to weigh and measure the silver, the gold ingots, or whatever you were trading with, and you had to agree on them. But once you had these coins that were issued and stamped, it was a sort of provably fair type of money. And so all of a sudden you could have a retail market where people could come and buy goods. And so this was sort of the beginning of what I'm calling markets eating the world, that we started to see the limits of coordination and scalability expand from just the state to markets. So, this is the retail market, and obviously, Amazon is sort of the logical conclusion of where this trend began. So you were able to see, the Greek Agora, the suburban shopping mall. All these are possible because of sort of these lower transaction costs. Enabled by money. Obviously, one of the first people to talk about this was Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations. And sort of what he observed was that markets made it possible to expand the limits of coordination scalability beyond the state across political boundaries. Using markets. There's sort of the famous story of the pencil manufacturer, that you have wood from Oregon and you have lead from Mississippi, and you're able to bring all these things around the world to produce these goods. So the industrial area, I'm kind of calling it division of labor is eating the world. We're able to use division of labor to expand markets. And sort of one of the evolutions of this as we got into the 20th century was the creation of mass production. And mass production was much more efficient than its sort of artisanal forebears. But in order to get that efficiency, you needed to have everything centralized. The supply chain was very fragmented. And so you needed to bring all those pieces together in one place in order to standardize it. So Henry Ford built a factory in Dearborn, Michigan in 1917, that literally took an iron ore and rubber at one end and put out cars in the other end. So all of this within one single factory, one single firm. Obviously today, Ford is much more, the supply chain has developed much more, it's much more fragmented. Ford buys most of their products, most of their components from upstream suppliers. They're not manufacturing them. And part of the reason for this, so this is sort of, these are high transaction costs. You need to centralize everything within the firm in order to get the benefits of mass production. So you have this sort of situation of firms and markets as these separate but interacting entities. And this starts to change with computing. So one of the things that allowed sort of Ford to start to move things outside of the company, other companies, was that if you're trying to coordinate the actions of a lot of different individuals, computers are a really efficient way to do that. They were developed as sort of command and control systems that, in particular, brought down search and measurement costs. So you think about triangulation, transfer, and trust. When everyone has a GPS in their pocket, it's a lot easier to identify people. This makes possible things like Uber, right? The triangulation cost is much lower than calling for a taxi. And then you have this lower transfer cost through matchmaking. We have all these marketplaces on the internet that are able to match, very specific consumers with very specific producers. You can be in Nashville and type in barbecue restaurant, and a restaurant could advertise just to people in a certain zip code or geographic radius. So we started to see the sort of interaction of firms and markets, sort of the beginning of markets starting to eat into firms, that for certain industries, hotels, newspapers, taxis, retail, you had markets. You had these sort of firm market hybrids, where there was a firm that was basically overseeing a market. And one of the things it made possible was specialization of labor outside of the firm. So, the product designer, sort of pre-internet, either had to find distribution through some existing retail channel or work for a company that did. And then all of a sudden you had Amazon, which has, effectively infinite shelf space. I think about half of Amazon sales are now third-party sales, right? So anyone can sort of go there. So you can have these highly specialized labor that's operating outside of the firm. So we got this sort of two-structure system. You had these giant scale businesses, the aggregators, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and these very niche businesses. They're able to leverage the low cost of distribution to reach these very, very targeted groups of customers, high-end cat furniture or whatever it was. And so you saw this reduction in triangulation and transfer cost. In certain sectors, firms started to shrink. But you didn't see it in some areas going back. The trust cost didn't really change a lot. And so I think when you start to think about money is obviously a very high trust thing. You care a lot about your money. This is a $100 trillion note from Zimbabwe, which is obviously not great. There's an idea from a political economist called Bruce Bueno de Mesquita called the selector spectrum. And he talks about this idea that in a political system, you can choose between robustness and efficiency. So a dictatorship is very, very efficient, right? You can get a lot done, and you can get it done very, very quickly. But it's not very robust. It's easy to coerce people. You can do things. You can do bad things as efficiently as you can do good things. Whereas democracies tend to be the opposite. They're much less efficient. It's much harder to get things done, but they also tend to be more robust. It's hard for one individual or a small group of individuals to change how things are done. And so I think this sort of same concept applies to what Bitcoin did in the world of money. That instead of the Zimbabwe dollar on sort of the far end, or maybe the US dollar in the middle, where you have a relatively small group of individuals that can exert power over it, on Bitcoin you have 100,000 people running full nodes. And so, anyone can change anything about Bitcoin as long as you can convince 100,000 other people to agree to that change. So you have this trade-off of efficiency for much higher robustness, which, in the case of money makes a lot of sense. This is a scene from the Too Big to Fail movie, where basically, you get these 8 bankers in a room and are able to convince them sort of how to change the global monetary system. There's not really an equivalent of that for Bitcoin. You can't get 8 people in a room. So then you can start to think about what could you do more with Bitcoin. Now you have sort of a market for money that Bitcoin created. Because it's able to do these things, it has these properties that don't coexist in sort of electronic fiat or gold. It's divisible and transportable, but also has this large selectorate and the censorship resistance that comes from that. So you start to get more towards what I'm calling sort of this blockchain area, where triangulation cost, transfer cost, and trust cost all start to come down. So you start to figure out, what can we do on top of this sort of secure base layer with Bitcoin? Obviously, the Lightning Network with payments, mesh data apps, all with this sort of low transaction cost of trust base layer. So what are the other markets that could start to eat the world? And that's it. Thank you.